All right, welcome. We are on week 7 where we're talking about money, wounds, and abundance. And I just wanted to start with um, a quote that's been kind of percolating as I've been preparing for this week from Hello Dolly. So I like show tunes, musicals. And so the sentence that is kind of repeated in there about money is money, if you pardon the expression, is like manure. It's not doing anything unless it's spread around helping new things grow. And so this kind of metaphor of manure and that cycle, nourishing and the older generation and so on, nourishing the younger generation and so on. I think that's part of this connection we're bringing here in this call about money wounds, and then the abundance piece, which often go hand in hand. We can't separate the two necessarily. And so that's where I wanted to talk about. Do you want to kind of start for a little bit, Mariah? Or
Be helpful if I unmuted myself. Yes, sure. I can start us off and then you can jump in. So I think, as we were prepping for this week, and we were talking about it, and, I was saying, this is still, I feel like this relationship with money and having like a healthy relationship with money in a system where money is used in such destructive ways is still one of my biggest growing edges in this work. I mean, I'm always growing in all the areas and looking to like where I can grow and learn more. But this is like, I mean, it feels like, I was saying, it feels like just like the concepts and the way money is used and the whole like grid of energy around money can feel so toxic and so like capitalistic and like all of the things that I don't like. And it can be really hard to shift the view of money, knowing that that's like how it's used and perceived in our system, right? And so part of like our work is to be able to shift that, even though it's still being used in these other ways. And I can't remember who said this, but a couple years ago, there was a discussion online where someone was, talking about like not all commerce is capitalism, right? Like people have been exchanging goods and services using currency, using money for thousands of years, actually. So money far predates capitalism. It predates even like the Roman Empire, and like it's been used in many parts of the world. On this continent, I know people used wampum, the shell beads, and as a form of currency. And so the concept of money is very ancient and has not always been used in a hoarding, destructive, primitive accumulation kind of way, right? So it's just important to remember that. And I think one of the other, we did this talking and reading last week about the systems work, systems thinking, and the leverage points, right? And I think if we think about that list where it's from like the least to the most effective, and the most effective is like the paradigm shifting stuff, right? The least effective is like the physical alterations. It can be very easy, especially with money, to think that we need to alter the physical alterations, even though that's often the hardest thing to change, right? So like, I just need more money right now. Like I need to meet this gap. I need to make more money. I need to have more money in my bank account. Like I'm always falling short, like these kinds of things. Or maybe I'm not able to save for the things I want. I'm not able to give and redistribute to my community financially in the way I want. All these things, I think it can be easier for us to get stuck in thinking that we need to shift it using those like more physical leverage points of like, how much money do I actually have? What is the actual amount in my bank account? What is the structure, right? And yet actually the greater leverage points may be those more about the paradigm and how we're thinking about money, the information flows. So like knowing we're going to do in a week or two, I can't remember, but we're going to do kind of know your numbers stuff, because, you know, just like actually having the information and tracking the information about like where are things coming in and out and how and when, and just knowing that and having awareness of that can actually change a lot for us. And a lot of us, you know, don't have as much awareness of that as we could. And so that can be a really effective leverage point. The kind of like rules and ways that we organize our money, the power of, you know, changing our mindset around that. And I also want to say here, because I think the idea of changing our mindset around money and manifesting money and all of this kind of stuff gets talked a lot about in kind of like new age, white dominated, spiritual, whatever, business, entrepreneur communities a lot, right? I'm sure you're all somewhat familiar with this, The Secret and like this kind of manifestation stuff. And if you just change your relationship with the money, it will flow to you. And there's really not like an additional analysis of power and privilege and race and, you know, all of these systemic factors that we know are also influencing both the actual access to resources we have, but also how we think about it. So if you think about it, like if you are raised in a white middle-class household, even if you're not necessarily wealthy, you just have this basis of like your basic needs are always provided for. And maybe it's easier for you to get a job or for money to flow in. Maybe it's not the amount you want, but you already have this like basic mindset. Whereas if you have the intergenerational trauma, you know, if your ancestors were enslaved or discriminated against or colonized, and the wealth and the resources were actually robbed, and then there may be several generations of like barely scraping by, right? Like your basic mindset on that, just on kind of like a DNA structural level, is going to be really different. And so I think a lot of the manifestation stuff that gets talked about in the kind of, I know, Lily, I see you using like the word boss babe on Instagram, like the boss babe and the spiritual, whatever, manifesting communities, is really just toxic in that way, that it's not taking into account any of those other factors. So like if you're already starting off at a certain level, yeah, it's going to be easier. The mind does influence matter. Like I do think that there is something to the energetics and the manifestation, like, and the magic. Like I am not actually saying that any of that stuff doesn't exist, very much the opposite, but we also have to weave in the structural analysis, because without it, we're just replicating those systems of power and privilege, and we're not actually working towards any kind of like a liberatory framework. Anuradha, did you want to jump in and say anything else there?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for saying those things. Those are really important points of how can we, like, let's say in our business or in ways, how can we use this leverage point, right? So I'm thinking of, you know, with the big enough lever, we can lift the earth kind of metaphor. That's it, you know, that kind of thinking. When I was a teacher or here as a business owner, and certainly in the poorer districts that I worked in, we didn't have access to that. Those were allocated to certain kids, and the kids I was given were not going to get a dime of that. We got the books that were ripped and written in, and I didn't have a classroom. I had a cart that I had to push from classroom to classroom, and so on. So the resources, access, and that's different than the lifestyle I had, right, grown up in, middle class, kind of working with these students. And I still wanted to, the work I saw was uprooting the indoctrination, that would have more good than me necessarily doing anything different. and using the resources that were at hand. We're often broken whatever stuff, and still I would find ways to get them to think about. And let me give you an example of how that applies here. And you can do this kind of activity on your own. I had them on maybe the second week of school draw an image of what they thought a scientist looked like, when I taught science, obviously. And the number of kids, and you can imagine what sort of drawings that might be popping up into your head. White, crazy hair, like, wild hair, test tube maybe. These are the kind of drawings we'd get, Einstein kind of hair, and so on. And by the end of the year, we would do the activity again, because we had seen, oh, even what we do in our kitchen has some chemistry in it. Even what we do, what we see photosynthesis happening is chemistry. And so plants are doing it. So who is a scientist, and so on, and why are we lauding certain types and ignoring others, the contribution of others, right? So here with the money, it's the same kind of thing. That paradigm shift is what I wanted. Now, what they do with that paradigm shift is more important than them memorizing all these facts about an atom. And so here we have the same opportunity to look at that relational thing with our money. So it's not necessarily changing currency or changing our bank, although we can make those kinds of structural changes, although I really want to divest. What I do with it, or how I view it, or how I am going to now think about it and talk about it and be with it, is drastically different and inherently anti-capitalistic. Those are going to have bigger ripples, in my opinion, than, oh, do you memorize how debt works? Well, you can, if you're curious, please do that. But where is, and so not just focused on the bottom line, but also looking at, with our yields, what's in our environment, what's already here. I could lament over the fact that these books were torn up and whatever, but instead I found other ways to engage the kids. I had students who couldn't read, all of these kinds of things. And that, I didn't want that to stop me. Here, them to come in and say, I don't do science and I can never be a scientist, is there a mentality? We can, if we uproot that a little bit, oh, I'm doing science anyway, that's going to open some doors, right? Maybe. So, and for them to, what's the heart of science is the scientific method, which is curiosity, being curious. And so that's the gift that I gave them. Not necessarily, hey, this is a bunch of science facts that you may change in 5 years, in fact, because we learned a little bit more. So I want you to think about it like that. And with the iceberg activity, we talked about last time about this kind of, with our wound. I'm just going to use the same iceberg activity that Mariah explained last time, if that's okay, Mariah. Where we have this kind of event with money, with a wound, right? And that's going to be in our present day. We might see it regularly. And then we can kind of go back and look at trends and patterns. We're going to talk more about that flow of money in a different week, as Mariah mentioned. But we can start looking at this event pattern. And hey, was this the same pattern that happened previously? And so on, generationally? Because in my Bharatanatyam research, which basically one of the tenets I figured out was there's a generational echo in how we form our identity. So here there's going to be a generational wound and strength. Here I don't want to just say only talk about the wound part, but there is a part that's inherited in us. And they've done plenty of studies where this is true in worms or whatever, testing a worm on, and then 13, 14 generations later, because their life cycle is shorter. If we did this with humans, the scientist is not going to be around. So it's easier to do it with organisms that multiply a bit faster. By the 14th generation, they didn't do the same treatment to these middle generations. They do the same treatment again to the 14th generation. It remembers. It has the same response. So we've done this with famines. They've looked at records with feast or famine years versus type 1 diabetes or other disease conditions. So it's been done in a lot of different ways. We have a heredity of survival or some other mechanism with money or abundance or whatever that may be. So historically in my family, I can look at what are the structures. Well, when my dad was born, or when the boys were born in my dad's side of the family would buy a new cow, a cow to and that's symbolic. For the girls, that's not what happened. The girls got money set aside for a dowry. So that no money put into their education. I mean, some of them got some schooling, but most of them had the last daughter that's one up from my dad actually got to go to university. She's the only one in their whole generation that got that. Everybody else got elementary school, maybe slightly better education. So the treatment, and yet the 4 boys got all the way through university kind of training. So that's the kind of investment. And you have to stay home, you have to get married before your period starts. You are now somebody else's, you're going to go live with your mother-in-law and you're going to take care of them. And so that doesn't go away in one generation. Now it's improved, meaning most of my cousins have education if they care for it, that are girls. But that still element of historically underfunding based on gender is still in the reality that's there. And then the expectation of that invisible labor is still there. So we have to, and I just was talking to my friend Graham, who does work with moms, and there is a penalty for marriage penalty for in terms of wage gap, meaning you get married or have children, your income drops. And yet a married man with kids will get progressively more pay or more leeway in the company. And so they get a bonus, so to speak. So these are all part of our histories now. And so when we look at this specific pattern, we have to look at this kind of global context of how is this impacting our money? What are the patterns? What are the structures? And then now how are we reacting with it, within it, right? And this is where we can maybe make different choices. So it doesn't always have to be money. That's what I want to be really clear. It can be resource propagation as well. And I'll give you an example and then I'll pass the mic back over to Mariah. I started this project called the 100 Hands Project. It's basically, and this is not a promotion, please don't feel like you need to go sign up for it. I'm just giving you a model of something I did, okay? It's not to sell anything. But this 100 Hands Project is, I use scientific hand analysis, which was created by this guy here. I've got his book here, so I'll show you, Richard Unger. And he's talking about looking at this study of dermatoglyphs, basically looking at fingerprint patterns. And after looking at some, in their organization, maybe hundreds of thousands of prints at this point, but he looked at several tens of thousands of hands and found certain patterns. So he's looking at ancient palmistry, but also this modern piece that he added. And he's created this system, but it's mostly marketed. There's people who are selling this service for up to 3,000 or more. So maybe 100 pounds up to, I've seen people charging 3,000 USD. So that's not a budget that most of us, it's certainly not in my budget. The 100-pound one maybe, but the 3,000-pound one, forget it. And it might be worth that. It might be totally valuable. And I'm thinking, okay, I don't have a lot of cash, but I have time and I can give my labor. And so I've made this offering to make it accessible to marginalized individuals. And so there's a real cost, meaning these ink sheets cost. I have to mail something across the world. So those costs need to be covered and so on. So I have real costs, i.e. taxes, i.e. whatever. So those things need to be cost. I've kept it as low as I could. And then the rest of my labor, I'm essentially not charging for it, but I'm making this service as a taster, a 30-minute, and I always over deliver. That's just the way I am. But that now I can make this service accessible to people who it's normally marketed to middle class, people with some disposable income. And I'm saying, no, that's not who this product is for. This product is specifically for people who wouldn't normally have this. And so then I'm thinking access, I'm thinking of redistribution, but not of money, but how powerful it is to know what are we designed to do in our hands, because there's certain things that our hands can tell us about ourselves, our patterns, our ways of being. And if I can empower 100 people, that would be 100, a lot of people are doing these 100 conversations or 100 thing offerings in the same way. And that's a way we can impact people, and it doesn't have to do with money exchange necessarily. So I want you to think that's a leverage point. Now, if I think, oh, I'm just going to now, I want to go change how the schools are run and so on, that's like a lot of work. I can't imagine how I could do that. I mean, barely could change anything in my own school. Forget about how schooling works in general and the indoctrination and all of these things, white supremacy, all of these pieces. I can't do that. I mean, maybe I could, but I didn't feel like taking that on. Mother Jones did something about that, though, with stopping child labor. So when we think like that, it's a paradigm shifting. Oh, kids under, here at least in this country, under 16s don't have to work. So that they need to be in school that time. So we want to go as deep as we can with that paradigm shifting capacity, right? Within that doesn't like tire us out. That's within my capacity. I can read 100 hands. And since my needs are taken care of, I can pass this knowledge, I think it's important wisdom. I can pass it on. So that didn't actually have to do with a lot of money exchange, but it had to do with this paradigm shifting thing of this is part of my medicine. I can share it with more people. So that's where I will stop on this. I'll pass it back to Mariah.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. I think that's super helpful. I'm glad you brought up the piece about the epigenetics and the ancestral stuff, because, also when we look at the reading we were doing from Caliban, right, in the first couple of weeks, Caliban and the Witch, we saw how the wage got tied to certain kinds of labor and then reproductive labor gets erased, right? And I want to draw a connection with that and how many of us in our niche analysis were having trouble finding our yields, right? And those things are related because what got valued and what got tied to value hundreds of years ago and passed down through colonization and through all these, through capitalism, through these vehicles of these systems, is we are still internalizing today. And so, that sense of what is valuable is something we also have to shift in our relationship with just like the flow of resources and yields and abundance and money. It's not just about what gets paid for, right? Just we were talking about last week. We were, yesterday Honorata was saying, yeah, like this stuff, it gets really invisibilized because you wash the dishes and then they're dirty again and you wash them again. There's no net outcome that you ever see in the way we've been taught to think of like having a net outcome or basically primitive accumulation, right? Where there's actually like something that is accumulated, this wealth that grows. But if you aren't doing those, like if you never wash your dishes, very soon you will feel the effects of that in your home, right? So realizing the value that is tied to those things that aren't monetized as well is super important, because we tend to then tie our value, right, to the money. And even if we've been working on that, it can be hard when we don't have access. So I love your example about the 100 hands, because that's a way that you're working from the other side of creating access. And one of our assigned readings this week is from Edgar Villanueva. He wrote the Decolonizing Wealth book that came out this year. Great book. The article is kind of like a little summary of it that he wrote, but the book is super easy to read. I read it in like 2-3 days. Really great. And he's an Indigenous guy that's been working in philanthropy for over a decade. And so he's talking to people that are controlling big amounts of money in the philanthropy world. And he's talking to them both on the funding side and on the investing side. So like how they can invest their money in impact investing in ways, people say like it's not possible, but in ways that are actually totally divested from things like fossil fuels and, that are in credit unions and community banks. And then also how on the funding side, he's just talking about how still few, like people recipients of these funds are Black, are people of color, are and so he's talking about ways that money, the article that he wrote here is called Money as Medicine. He's talking about how we can take this thing that can be seen as really toxic and actually be seen as medicine. And he talks about like his culture. He's Lumbee indigenous person from the North Carolina region, and he, talks about the worldview of anything can be medicine, right? And some medicines can also be poisonous. Like some medicines, if we take too much, it's a poison, right? And so the way that we use it can be medicinal or it can be toxic. And so I think that there's some potent stuff in there for all of us, even if we aren't controlling large amounts of money. And he's also using this leverage point, right? Like he has this access. Anuradha, you have this access of this leverage point of the skill of hand reading. You're making that accessible. He has this leverage point of knowing all these people in the world of philanthropy and using that as a leverage point to shift their mindset. Wealthy people that have these big family funds shift their mindset so that the change happens from there, right? So we can all kind of use our own skills and talents to be making these shifts in more systemic ways. And it can look really different, right? Those two examples look really different. And I also want to quote Anuradha again here from a few months ago. We were talking about how like, a lot of us will have like a GoFundMe or like Anuradha, when you're doing your dance and you're asking for funding to help some seed money to help your creative project, or, someone else is behind on their rent, or, whatever it is, like my dad gets really sick. We have all these things that we need money for. And often we'll give to each other's like GoFundMes or whatever. And it's like $10, we're basically passing around the same $10. Like, I give it to you one month and then you give it to this person and then you both give me $10 one month. And so we're just kind of passing around the same $10. So from like a capitalist kind of like primitive accumulation standpoint, it's like, what's the point? Everyone should just keep their $10, right? But from a point of view of money as medicine, that's actually building community, right? Like I know that you don't have a lot of extra resources, but the fact that you gave $10 when I was in need, like I feel cared for. I feel part of community. And I can't tell you how many times I've had $20 in my bank account and given 10 of it to someone's GoFundMe. It's like that value that we can find in building community, even if it's not with a vast amount of resources, can make a real difference and can be really healing and supportive. And I think we all know this. We all experience this in different ways. So it's really, then it's about tying it to these other relationships, right? Whereas a lot of the, ways of accumulating wealth in capitalism are tied to exploitation and a real lack of relationship, or a relationship that is abusive, essentially, right? Like the relationship of the modern nation state as a construct to the people in it is an abusive, it's often mirrors like a domestic violence abusive situation, right? It's the same kind of power dynamic. And I think wherever we fall on that, there's work to do, just like Edgar Villanueva is doing this work with the people who have accumulated this wealth. And we're doing often this work more with people who maybe are a little more marginalized. There's work to do on both ends because, like you were saying, Anuradha, there's this epigenetic trauma is super real, and that's inherited. And that's a thing that by starting to rebuild our community and our worth and our relationships in this way, and be sharing resources in this way, that is also healing ourselves individually as well as building our community and relationship. Because if we think about our health as being tied to the healthiness of our relationships, right? This woman, Cherokee woman from North Carolina, Randy Bird, I can't remember if I said this, but they were talking about identity politics at a conference, and she said, my personal identity is other people. My personal identity is other people. And so, like, if we are starting to, it's like you were saying, you know, this individualistic way of thinking about ourselves, it's not really tied to the whole system. So in using money in this way, we can tie ourselves to a greater community, and we can use it as medicine, and it can be healing. And I want to say one more thing there, and then I'll pass it back to you, Anuradha. So we had put here this example. So here we've had some examples where we're tying in ecological kind of case studies. And in the Northeast where I live, there's been a particular invasive that has really started to take over a lot of our roadsides and riversides. It's called Japanese knotweed. And it's sort of a bamboo-like, it could grow up to like 10 feet tall in the summers, sort of like a bamboo-like plant. And it's basically impossible to eradicate. Like once it's in a place, if there's even a tiny little bit of the root left, the whole patch will regrow. Like there's nothing you can do basically once it's there. So this has been crowding out a lot of our native plants. It's been causing a lot of problems if it gets in people's yards or gardens. I mean, that's what it is now. And so we've seen that be an issue and it be treated as this invasive and this problem. Simultaneously with climate change and the tick season increasing, we've seen a real increase in Lyme disease. And so we've seen a lot more ticks. We've seen them earlier without the cold winters. Fewer of them are dying off and more of them are carrying Lyme disease. We also see loss of habitat for possum and other animals that eat the ticks or eat the mice and the animals that carry the ticks. And so all of these things are connected, right? As it turns out, Japanese knotweed can be made into a tincture or a tea and be used as a prophylactic against Lyme disease. You can take it either preventatively. It's very bitter, so it's not very delicious, but you can also like highly dose on it if you get a tick bite. And I know many people who have gotten Lyme positive tick bite who have just like heavily dosed on Japanese knotweed for a few weeks and been totally fine. They tested the tick and it had Lyme and they didn't contract Lyme. So it's interesting if we notice, okay, the rise of this one thing here is countered by the rise of this other thing that actually has the ability to be the antidote and the medicine for that. And so where can we see the things that maybe look like we can see, okay, this looks like an invasive, it looks like a problem, but if we look at the other uses, in the spring, you can also eat the little stalks. They're kind of like a rhubarb-y tasting a plant. So it's also an edible. And so, you know, where can we find the medicine? And I think that's true a lot with money too. Regardless of the amount of wealth or resources you control, there's ways that you can use it medicinally. And rather than see it as like, this is a thing we have to totally abolish, how can we use it medicinally? And, you know, that's going to maybe involve also not basing our entire lives around money in the way that we do in our current system, or we're forced to, right? We're forced into this bottleneck. So that's part of the work we're doing here is what are these strategies we can use to base our lives more on relationship than the amount of resources we control. I hope that's all making sense. Please feel free to pop in the chat box or unmute yourself and say anything if you have comment or question there.
If either of you want to say something, of course, just go for it. Thank you for what you're saying about the that yield piece of where is our yield, right? And so that's part of our inherited trauma, absolutely. And I like what you're talking about, the primitive accumulation. That's really one of the central pieces from that Caliban that we can really bring forward here. This is where I also think the leverage point makes sense here. What's the goal? So if our goal is to make as much money as possible, then the most efficient way is capitalism. I mean, that's essentially what it's done. Let me exploit people, let me own the means of production, and let me accumulate wealth that's not just mine, but based on the labor of other people. Like that's the most efficient way. But if your goal is how can I serve as many people, or if my goal is how can I undo these traumas, how can I reclaim myself, how can I do my work in the world, so these questions, that's a paradigm shifting question of not what's in my bank account. Because if I was going to make a bank account question, then it would be clear, hey, I could work for a biotech firm or the military. Those are the kind of people who would recruit somebody like me. Is that what I want to participate in, ecocide or hurting people? Because those are not in alignment with my values. And fine, if I had to live like that, then I have to live like that. There are people who need money and so they must work. Okay, that's part of capitalism. But the minute I know I don't need to do that, then that's not a direction I'm going to focus. What is going to bring me meaning? What is the highest good I can bring to a situation? And so these are paradigm shifting. The action is less important. It's the question and the intent at this stage, right? As we're moving now into the second half, now we can deepen these practices. But what kinds of questions are you asking? And I like your question, Mariah, of where is the medicine? Where is the medicine? Where is there slack in our systems that we can pick that up? These shoes, people are making all these leather goods, that not leather goods, but and I bought one for my husband, these shoes made out of rubber that from tires. His wallet, I got him, and it's an old fire hose, and they cut it up and turned that in, repurposed it into to wallets or other materials. So hey, that's something. We've got garbage. Can we reuse that? Can we do something with that? Absolutely. So that's a medicine, right? There's lots of garbage and we don't think very highly of that. I do want to also speak to, we were meant to have Sophie in here, just the times didn't coordinate because her class is at the same time ours is. But I wanted to give you an essence of what I learned from, I got to spend an afternoon with Sophie when she was in England before. And one of the experiences I've had in walking on the streets in London or other cities is there's no wealth here. Meaning there's no wealth, meaning you're bumping into people on the sidewalk. There's not a whole lot of space to get comfortable and like get to know somebody, right? You're just kind of bumping arms on the subway or, so there's not a relational wealth. There could be, but there often isn't. There's not a lot of wealth in terms of new life shooting up through the sidewalks or whatever. I mean, so it feels like this dearth, but the afternoon I spent with Sophie was, it felt like leaning into possibility of where is the wealth? Let's get curious about that. And we did different things, and most of which didn't require money or a lot of money. It was, walking around a feminist exhibit at a museum, was going to a church and listening to the Evensong, and I'm not of that faith at all, but that space was beautiful, and that, the intention that was set in that environment. So here, I want you to get curious of, we don't, in fact, from my biology training, one of the phrases that has stuck with me all these years is a lot of people think, let's gut the rainforest and we've got the land and then all that richness in the soil will be there. And that's not honestly how it works. The richness in an ecosystem is in that transference. It's in that connection. It's the web of life. It's the movement that Hello Dolly quote of the manure and being spread around. That's where the wealth is. The wealth is in the interaction. And in capitalism, we feel we've got to own it and manipulate it and whatever. And that's where the wealth is. Transactional. And so here I want you to be thinking in ways of, how is this relationship bringing wealth? So your just mere presence is bringing wealth. How are you choosing to interact? Who are you choosing to interact with? There's wealth in that, right? In whatever relationships there might be. And that could be relationship even to self or higher self or God or whatever you might believe in. It could be relationships with family or friends or whatever. It could be client relationships or work relationships. And also this interaction with our space, with time. There's so much places for us to get curious and be abundant and feel abundant. And that is not always, I think the point around the primitive accumulation that hit me the hardest is when I went to India and I saw some of the things that my family was having to do. And this idea of, we've become so complacent of, we're just going to turn on the tap and water's going to come out, and we could go to the grocery store and go grocery store once a week and have food for the whole week. You know what I mean? This is this kind of thinking. And in some places, there is such a subsistence thing. They got water, government water, every 2 days, 3 days. And if somebody wasn't awake at 2 o'clock in the morning or whenever their assigned time was, the water would come out of a pipe in front of their house. If nobody was there to capture it, then you have no water for cooking or bathing or anything. And cooking water had to be captured and put separately. Okay, I don't know if the situation's changed, but this was, even my last visit, 2007, this was still happening in a major city in a middle-class family. So I want you to imagine how blessed we are. We forget this interaction. This every day we need water. Every moment we need air to breathe. Every moment we have to think about food all the time. We don't have to go hunt it now. We don't have to go gather. We don't have to have a farm. We can choose to do those things. That's not the only way we can. But so I want you to bring it back to this kind of subsistence, day-to-day movement, and not necessarily with exploiting. Because even when we buy stuff like chocolate, we're exploiting, because that wouldn't come to us unless it was based on, if we had to pay the real living cost to everybody in that supply chain, it wouldn't be in our budget. The only reason we can afford it is because, and not saying now give up chocolate. I'm saying I want you to just be thinking about, where is the wealth, where is the wound, because they're both in the same thing. And instead, could we enjoy seasonal fruit that was picked from a farmer locally that is now getting a living wage, bought from a farmer's market? It might be the same cost, but the farmer's going to get more this way versus the exploited labor the other way. And so it's just these choices of, there's moment-to-moment choices available to us. And that's the kind of thinking that I really like what Mariah said about that accumulation. When we're buying a stack of chocolate bars, that's accumulation too. And what are we accumulating? Is that what we want in our energy? I'm not saying I still eat chocolate. Okay, so full transparency here. It's just an example. And I'm not talking about the purity, as Mariah also mentioned earlier in the group. So that's what I had. And that same 10 pounds has saved so many of my friends, right? It strengthened our relationships. And instead of giving that 10 pounds to a stranger, I'm more likely to put it aside because I know a friend might need it. And that's strengthening our relationship there, because that's a choice of, oh, I've got a little bit I can give them. So, and that could ease ease what their needs are for today. So this is that relational model. And it doesn't make us wealthier necessarily, but it brings us richness in a whole lot of other ways, right?
Yeah, I love that example, because too, it makes me think about in a number of cultures, there's this I don't know, in Senegal, they call it tontines. I think they call it different things in different places, but it's like a circle of people, and they, like everyone say is committed to being in the circle for a year, and they meet once a month, and you like share food and community, and you give in a certain amount of money every month. So it might be $20, it might be $100, or whatever, currency you're using. And everyone gives the same amount every month, and they, draw straws or whatever. And so then everyone takes a turn being the recipient that month. So you don't actually, there's not like an accumulation overall, but it's a way for people to actually, it's easier to put aside $20 every month than it might be to put aside $1,000, right? Like it's a way of using community and relationship building to also save and also have access to a larger chunk of money. And people use this to like start their business or, buy a fridge or whatever it is that they need. And then this concept has been like really co-opted in some like women's spiritual circles where there's these giving circles where you have to recruit like other people to come in and pay in, right? And you always have to recruit other people, which is more like a pyramid scheme kind of structure. And it's like, that's what we do when we take this like basically indigenous practice that's about relationship and community building, and there's not really an accumulation that one person ever gets. It's all in the community just being passed around, as opposed to having to recruit new people. And then at some point the thing falls apart. And so some people get paid and some people don't. They paid in and they don't get paid. So, there's ways that these things, like tracing the roots of a lot of even the toxic things we can trace them back to more indigenous practice that actually is about building community. And the compost thing too, like I was thinking, anyone who's had like a rich compost pile, if you leave it and you don't cover it, what happens? A million weeds grow in it, right? Like it's not just like one thing grows. In a place where the soil is rich, there's lots of life fighting for the chance to have those nutrients in the sunlight and all of that. And, and also there's symbiosis there too. And so, this idea of like the wealth or the nutrients just feeding one plant or one person is totally doesn't exist in nature really. And so I love that example. And I love what you said about asking better questions too. I think that's something that we should always be doing, asking better questions. So like the question of like, why don't I have more money in my bank account is not the worst question, but it's kind of a boring question, right? Like, it's like, I see people do this a lot with cultural appropriation. Like, where is the line that I can go up to? Like, how can I not culturally appropriate? Like, what is the line I can go up to before? Like, that's a shitty question. Like, ask a better question, right? And so I just think we can always be asking better questions, like when we are thinking about any of these topics. And especially with the money and the resources, like we can get stuck in a really kind of small perspective of what's important. That being said, increasing our flow of abundance and resources and money and feeling more secure in that is also important. And so we've assigned you Alexis P. Morgan. Some of you may follow her. She's awesome. She just wrote this awesome blog post, which we've linked here in the group in the readings, that is called Money Magic, 7 Ways Your Financial Sorcery Could Use a Holistic Boost. And she gives really specific examples of things that you can do. And so what we'd like to, your assignment or one of the practices for this week would be to play with your relationship with money in a kind of more ritual way. And that could look like having a gratitude practice. I usually, when I get a physical check or physical cash that I'm paid in, I'll pretty much always put it on my altar for at least a couple of days before I deposit it or do something else with it. So I kind of offer it to my spiritual guides and the land and like the greater abundance that's feeding me. And I know the practice of like offering coins or offering, when I studied at a spiritual school in India many years ago, they taught us a ritual where we would get 108 coins, and then for 21 days we would offer them to an altar, and we would be chanting a specific mantra. But then at the end we would donate all the money. And so there's things you can play with that. You could even just make a list, a gratitude list of, all the resources you're grateful to have. It doesn't have to just be money. And then there's some other specific examples that Alexis talks about. And she does have a pretty strong grounding in like an anti-capitalist perspective, of how we can kind of magically increase our luck and increase the amount of money that kind of stays with us, not in a hoarding sense, but in a sense of, that doesn't all just flow out and go away and leave us totally drained. And so I encourage you to read that and just start to play ritually. And it can be a very small daily thing that you do. You could also go outside. I have a friend, one of the other programs I work with, the Wildwood Path, which is a 9-month mentorship circle for women and trans folks in wilderness skills. And my friend who started the program last summer, it was like our program starts in October, and there were only like 2 people signed up in August. And she was like, we were like, okay, what's going on? And then she did this whole ritual one day. She spent like the whole day. She went outside and she made this like womb out of mud in the outdoors, and did this ritual and did all of these offerings of songs and food and alcohol and all these things. And like within 2 weeks, like the program filled, like 17 people applied, like just like that. So, these things do have real impacts that we can do. So just start to think about how you might play with that. And so we know that we were talking with Shirley at the beginning of the call, how the systems thinking stuff and the leverage point stuff was really dense last week. And we encourage you to still be thinking about that and working with that. You could use, the other assignment you could do is use the iceberg activity with your money. So it could be, the issue at the top could be not having enough money, or always coming up short, or whatever it is. And then you could, do that, the patterns and trends, the mental models and the systems and the structures. And you could look at that, but also we wanted to give something a little bit less academic. So be working in a more kind of ritual, energetic way, and starting to be thinking how you could have fun with that relationship and do something that feels good there. So any questions about that, obviously, feel free to ask, as always.
Yeah. And of course, tithing, that's what brought us together. Mariah started tithing into, this reclaimed space, or, Asian space. And she wanted to make a scholarship available with her yoga income. So it can be giving like that. It could be giving to self, right? So there's lots of ways to do it, right? That hard activity of always feeding and resting for ourselves, right? So there's a lot of different ways you can do it, but find meaningful ways to talk about that, to have a relationship. One of the things that I think we have and this is systemic, of like, imagine if you were sitting across from someone and they constantly said, you're not enough, and I don't like you, and whatever. Would you really stay in relationship with that person? And what a flip that would be to say, I honor you, and it's okay the way it is right now, and I love you, and hey, let's get clever, let's lean into possibility instead of always being in the shadows, the shadow frequency. Both are available to us. And what would it be like if you had a relationship with money? What would it like? Where is it, and where would you like it to be? And ritual is one way to help us connect with that, right? Be grateful for what money might be bringing us, whatever, and so on. So these are ways that we now start to stop thinking about money as a transaction or as a bank account or as a freeze frame scenario instead of a living, working, breathing thing that we, you know, a person almost personified. That's very much mythology in our culture, but whatever your culture, whatever your ways of being with money, what would it be like if you stopped viewing it transactionally and thought of it more relationally? You know, that's kind of a big shift. I think that's the biggest healing that can happen then. And not just for us, but those behind us, for our ancestors and those in front of us, that even if we don't have children, biological children, they're still descendants of people coming after us. What legacy can we do with that money? And there's always possibility. And when we think like that, and we think that it's 500 years of this nonsense, we don't need to figure it out all at once. We can just work on the part that's right in front of us. So give yourself a break too. You don't have to take it all on today, like, you know. So that's what I would like to add. And as always, I love rifting with you, Mariah. Can I say that? I love our relationship. I just want to love on you for a second. I really love our relationship. I feel like we're more than just co-teachers. We're really good friends because of all this too. So I appreciate that.
I love you too, and I love our relationship too. Any questions, thoughts, reflections, anything at all?
I want to say thank you. I feel like so many things clicked for me just listening to you too. Like I was having trouble really, I guess, like really trusting that the paradigm shift does more than like the physical shift, because, you know, I think that's what we're conditioned to focus on most of the time. But like, it just, I don't know, thinking of a personal example of like really wanting, like one of my biggest desires is to take care of my mom in her old age and just like let her take care of me. Like she doesn't have to do anything. Like I just want to take care of her. And even though we're still like a few years out from her retirement, there's already so much resistance to that on that part. And she's like, you know, but I can clean your house and I can, you know, like do all this stuff to like earn something. And so just thinking about how much I think we all resist just being taken care of for just without having to earn it, right? Just because we're worth it in our humanity. It just, I don't know, like I'm like, now it makes sense, right? Like if I could just like change my mom's mind about that, everything else would change for her. And so anyway, that's just, you know, my personal example, that it just like, that's what came to mind as you two were talking about that. And so now it makes sense. So thank you.
I love that. What a beautiful example. And I think, hey, about that community care part of, we've lost that about how we take care of our elders and our youngsters in that way with dignity. And we plenty of archaeologists have figured that out, and yet we seem to have forgotten, oh, we should be taking like that's like commonplace. But yeah, so we have to unlearn those things.
Right, yeah. So yeah, I mean, like to turn that back on myself, now I'm wondering, you know, where do I need to change my mind to let everything else flow? Like what shifts do I need to make? Yeah, just to like open myself up to something different.
I love that. That's such a great, profound question. To just let that reverberate, and the answers probably start popping up. If you do get insight, though, I'd love to hear it in this space if you want to share, of course. Shirley, would you like to say something as well, since you have our time?
Sure. Yeah, I just really appreciate the actually having a conversation and talking about this, because I think that it just like it never happens. Like even within like activist spaces, you know, and spiritual spaces, both of those, it's like you might talk about changing your relationship to things and talk about creating more relational ways of being, you know, being like in right relationship, um, and then like talking about like smashing capitalism in activist spaces, but there is no connection, you know, to how you have to do like both, if that makes sense, you know. And I just like personally, like my relationship to money is like really messed up, I think, just from like for so many reasons, you know, that it's like when you've lived um in poverty, and like coming from a family of immigrants where everything is about surviving and like making it, and to be successful isn't just about like assimilating, you know, into white supremacy, but it is like this overarching thing about like capitalism, and you have to accumulate and accumulate, and that's what it means to be like American, um, and how that just is so ingrained, you know, and how it's just hard when that's what your where your family is, you know, and when you're like the only one in your family who's like trying to think about it, and you get so much pushback when you try to think about it. So I just really appreciate having the conversation, because that's, even for me, that it was like kind of uncomfortable and hard, you know, to even think about this and talk about it, even when I know I should be. Yeah.
I totally hear you and honor that. And I know it can be really hard and even like triggering to talk about this stuff or hear about it. And I also just wanted to say, like, the thing you said about like the spiritual spaces and the activist spaces, I mean, this is like a thing that I've been like, I cannot say like resonate enough with that, because I feel like for a decade I've felt like, okay, like there's these two, they don't seem like they should be separate, but there's like these two paradigms, and there's things that I agree with in both of them. They're both really important to me, and yet we're not actually like merging them in a relational way. And so that's kind of the work that I've been focusing on in myself and my life for the past 10 years. And like this course is part of the accumulation of that, where it's like, okay, like it is possible to be talking about these things together and merging them. They're actually, the separation is such a false binary, and like is in itself a product of like colonialist thinking, right? So definitely validate that. Thank you for saying that.
And I also agree with the changing then the family part, or having space to talk about it. Absolutely, those are not easy things. And I want to say, instead of the should, maybe let's consider the word like invitation. Like, let's keep in ourselves, like, should is such a like a, it's got to be a certain way. I'm not saying, but even that is there's a different vibration to the word should, and there's a different, this is kind of the English major in me, right? There's a reason we use invitation or those kinds of words where it's open-ended and consent-based. To me, that's the way I would view it. Instead of should means it's dictatorial, it's very, right, put upon. So it's just like these little minor things can really, what would be the difference if you used should for 10 years or used I'm going to invite for 10 years in the same, it's that kind of thing. That's a paradigm shift of, oh, wow, it's just a silly word, and yet it has so many reverberations. Or you and your family being the first person to actually have this, well, it has reverberations. We might not be able to see all of those, what's going to happen. And that's the hard part, but sometimes, at least I struggle with that part of, oh, planting seeds with my students, I'm planting seeds with my kid. Oh, what's going to happen? I don't know. I don't get to see all of these things, but there's palpable shifts that happen, I think. So So well done for making the commitment to have the discussion, and same to you, Lily, for committing to say, hey, what can I do? And then I like that you shifted it into, let me look at the way I'm viewing the situation, or what parts. Yeah, I love that. That's so beautiful. It takes courage to have these conversations. So thank you for showing up and voicing something about where you are.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone else that's watching the recording. Please, we'd love to have you join the conversation and hear any reflections or things that were stirred up for you in the group. Yeah. And we'll see you all next week.
That sounds great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.